Hi, I'm Eric, and we're in the Kilnroom studio, and I'm going to show you how to throw a cylinder on the wheel. The first step is to have a nice wedged piece of clay and make it into a ball, and then literally throw it onto the wheel so that it gets stuck. You can push it towards the center because the first job is to get this ball of clay centered on the wheel. So we start by getting it centered while the wheel is stopped. I like to press down in the same motion repeatedly as I turn the wheel head manually. And by the time I've pressed all the way around that piece, it's now a little bit more centered and I can start throwing with water. All right. All right, so now we're going to start introducing water to the clay. But the first thing that is worth noting is that when you get water, you don't really want to use your sponge to get water. All you need to do to get water to your clay is to dip your hands in water and bring that over and let the water kind of drip on the clay. You don't want to put excessive amounts of water on there because water weakens the strength of your clay and it also fills up your splash pan quicker and you have more cleanup at the end. So now that we have water on our hands, the first step I'm going to do is to press my hands down on the clay, just on the outside of it, until the clay smears into the wheel head. When I stop the wheel spinning, you can see that the clay is now really well attached to the wheel head. And the reason I want to pay attention to that first is that when I initially put it on there, there's a little bit of a shadow there where water can get under and then cause the piece of clay to come spinning and fly off the wheel, which I like to say is always funny, but not a very safe thing. So you don't want that to happen. So now that the piece of clay is well attached to the wheel, I can really start the process of centering. And centering is just that, trying to get this piece of clay centered on the wheel. Really important when you're centering is to keep your elbows into your thighs. Your dominant hand should primarily be on the side of the piece, and your other hand can be pressing from the top and also pressing from the side. My dominant hand happens to be my left hand. So keep that in mind as I'm throwing. If you're right-handed, then you might be using opposite setup than I am. So centering is about having really steady hands approach the piece of clay. And so in a way that your hands affect the clay more than the clay affecting you. When the piece of clay is centered, your hands don't really move. When the piece of clay is off center, your hands move. So this is off center, and if my hand is on there, it's moving back and forth. I can make it a little bit worse. It's moving back and forth. And to simplify it, it's really an angled piece, but to simplify it, your hand is going back and forth because as the piece of clay spins away from your hand pushes through, and then the clay pushes back on your hand. And so that motion is repeated. So your job as the potter is to find a place in between that back and forth motion and keep your hands steady. So how you do that is through leveraging your body position. So again, elbows in your thighs so that you are anchored together. And then you'll notice that my thumbs are always touching each other. My fingers are often touching each other because if your hand is floating, then you're relying more on your body strength. Whereas all these times when you touch it together, it's going to give you a lot more strength. Okay, so we're talking about centering. And I like to, instead of telling people how to center, I like to talk about the concept of it more in various ways. So elbow in your thigh with your dominant hand on the side and your subdominant hand on top is a really common way to start centering, because if you can put just the right amount of pressure on this hand and just the right amount of pressure on this hand, it's almost like you're pushing down to a marble that's on the very inside of this piece, right in the center. You want to push towards that very center of the piece without pushing through it. If you push too hard, you're just going to push it off center. So that works for some people, but it doesn't work for all people. So another way to look at centering is just like you're shaping the clay. And that might be a fun way to start. If you're just playing around, you can just take your hands, maybe dig your fingers into it a little bit and play around with coming up with different shapes. When you're throwing, you want to have a very smooth mound of clay that has the widest point at the bottom and then goes to a high point in the middle and down the other side without many ripples or anything in the clay. But while you're centering the clay, you can play around with shaping it. And one common term for this is coning up. So when you squeeze the clay together and it grows upward in height, and then you take your hands and you put it on top and you compress the clay back down. Now, if I stop here, you can see that it's causing this like doorknob shape. And when I see that happening, I don't want to just keep pushing down because it's just going to get wider and wider. I need to make sure that I have pressure on the outside of that width as I push down from the top. And instead of, try to get my fingers out of the way, instead of creating that doorknob shape to get wider and wider, it pushes the clay back into itself. And while you're wedging, while you're coning up, you're also wedging the clay because of that, the notion that the clay, as you cone it up, it stretches, and as you cone it down, it gets compressed into itself. So as it gets pushed into itself, the clay from the interior works out, and it'll work out any pre-existing air bubbles that are in your piece. So if you didn't quite get all the air bubbles out when you wedge your clay, you can practice coning up. And if you cone up 3 times, oftentimes your piece of clay is centered, and you've removed some air bubbles. So coning up is a really good practice, especially when you get to the point where your piece is a little bit off center, but it's a nice shape, and you know it's taking you a really long time to get here, and so you kind of just like let your hands rotate on this thing a few times, and maybe that happens for 3 or 5 minutes, and you just can't quite get it. And what I'm thinking in that instance is that I don't want to mess up how far I've already come with this piece. So, but if that's the case, you got to get that out of your mind right away, because there's going to be so many times later on in this process that you're going to be able to mess up that pot. So if you find yourself just kind of riding on the piece of clay where it's just moving you a little bit, that might be a really good time to go ahead and break that fear of messing it up and just really change the shape by coning up. One more time on coning up is it's important to note that my hands aren't moving in such a way that they're bringing the clay up because I'm pulling the clay in any way. The clay is going up in height because I'm pressing together with my hands. And then the shape of my hands makes the clay grow upward in height. So it's just a compression to get that height. It's not actually pulling the clay up with my hands. So when you're centering, it's all about having very steady hands, locking your body parts together. I'll take my hands off the pot and try to show here that it's, multiple parts of my hands are touching together to try to keep my hands steady. You're also going to want to think about the shape of your clay. So it's fun to kind of play around and shape your clay, but when you want to throw your pot, what you want is widest at the base and highest in the middle. So when you take your hands off the piece, that negative space that you're making is what's shaping the clay. So if you're having issues with the clay not shaping correctly, you might be squeezing too hard and pulling your hands in. And then the third concept or third way of centering is coning up. It's probably the most effective way. It's also probably the most difficult way. So now that the piece is centered, we're going to go ahead and open the pot. That's the next step, is to open the interior of the pot. So what I do to do that is I have my thumbs in the middle, and when I can feel that I'm in the center of the clay, I start to press down, and when I can feel the clay gripping my fingertip because of friction, I'm going to add a little bit more water, and then I'm going to keep pressing down until I get the clay to be the right depth. A little bit more water. And after a while of throwing, you're able to know the depth of the pot, the depth you need to make the bottom, because you've trained yourself through muscle memory, but also your eyes, if you're blessed with sight, your eyes can tell the difference between the base of the clay here and the wheel head here. But while you're learning that, there's a really important trick to know, which is the needle tool measuring trick. So now I'm going to stop the wheel, and I'm going to press the needle tool right into the bottom until it hits the wheel head. Then I'm going to bring my finger down to where the clay is, and then hold my finger on the needle tool as I pull it out of the clay, and now I have a depth measurement. So that looks to be a little bit bigger than 1/4 of an inch. 1/4 of an inch is a good measurement to aim for. So I'm just going to compress that little needle hole back together. And the next couple steps, I'm going to be compressing the bottom, which is a really important step. So that little needle hole won't be an issue because it'll be well compressed. So the next step is to open the interior bottom of the pot. You can't just start pulling the walls up. You have to first establish the bottom. So the way that I do that is with my dominant hand, my left hand on the outside, and then with my right hand, pointer finger and middle finger, I'm going to find the center of the pot, and then I'm going to pull my finger towards my outside hand in a motion that's relative to the spinning of the wheel. So it happens fairly quickly, just like that. And now I'm going to flatten and compress the interior bottom. And the reason that you want to do this is because the clay is comprised of disc plate-like molecules. And they need to be compressed together so that they don't crack when the water dries and the clay shrinks. So good compression on the interior bottom of your pot is really important. It's also important to have a flat bottom because the wheel head is perfectly flat. So if your interior bottom is curved at all, there's going to be thick areas and thin areas in your base. So when you're throwing a cylinder, you want to have a nice flat interior bottom. And you can also work on this very interior corner and make sure that's a nice 90-degree angle so you're getting all the clay out of the inside. So before I do the pulling, making the walls taller, I want to get the clay back to the shape that I centered. In the process of opening the interior bottom, compressing it, that kind of expands the clay wall out. And if I start pulling the walls from there, the pot's going to naturally just drift out. And I don't want that to happen. What I want to throw is a straight-walled cylinder, and I'm fighting centrifugal force. So centrifugal force and gravity are always trying to make clay get opened up and fall down. So to fight that, as the wheel spins and I compress the clay and it grows in height, I'm going to be trying to make a volcano shape so that I can end up with a straight-walled cylinder. Being very helpful. Okay, so now that I'm ready to do the first pull is actually sort of just squeezing the clay between my fingers. My middle finger is touching the inside corner of the wall, and there's a little belly of clay on the inside that's caused when I shape the clay back, just like I did. It kind of expanded the inside. So I'm going to just keep my sponge in my outside hand so that it holds the moisture needed while I'm throwing and can kind of dry off the pot as I'm throwing as well. And then my inside hand with enough water for the clay to slip through my hand. And I'm just going to start at the bottom on the outside. On the inside, my fingers don't really move. On the outside, my thumb and pointer finger are pushing against the sponge, which is pushing against the inside of the pot. So I'm going to continue the motion of the pull off the pot. And my hands, again, are linked together because the fact that my one hand is grabbing onto my other one there gives my whole body more strength. So pull number 2 is next. When you're getting water, sometimes I do use my sponge when I'm getting water because I want to be able to direct the drip onto one of my fingers that will touch the inside of the pot so that the water actually goes where it's needed, which is on the inside wall of the pot, not just filling up in the bottom. So now for this pull, I'm going to create a little indent at the bottom, all the way at the very bottom of the wheel head, just pressing in. And then now I'm going to compress that clay together and go for pull number 2. It's important when you're pulling to note that it's not the pulling that makes the clay grow in height. It's the compression of the clay between your fingers that makes the clay have to change shape. And then with the direction that we're putting our fingers with the pull, we're trying to force the clay as it changes shape to go upward and inward. It's much easier said than done. And when you get to the top, I always like to do at the very end, just like go like a fake centimeter above the piece and just continue your pull, because that's where a lot of times beginners will mess up their pots, is they'll at the very end, it'll be a nice thing, and then they'll just jerk their hands away or take them away too quickly. So always be really cognizant that you're moving slowly and surely. Every movement should take about 5 or 6 seconds, especially when you're pulling up the side of the pot. So we're compressing the clay together. So the clay in any one given area is only affected when it goes through my fingertips. And if we make a mark in it and we spin that, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 revolutions, almost 1 revolution a second. And so I'm going to go for pull 2. Still plenty of water in there. I'm going to start pressing in. So I've already had the sponge on there for about 5 or 6 seconds. And as I move up, my hands move up so slowly that the clay spins 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times between my fingers. Because that's where you can make mistakes and that's where you can fix mistakes, is when the clay is between your fingers. You can't do anything about it when it's not between your fingers. And your fingers have to stay the same distance apart because you're compressing the clay. And if your fingers change distance, they get closer together or further apart within one of those revolutions, that's where the wobbles and some of the issues start. So when you're learning how to do this, you want to remind yourself to just keep your hands really steady. If you find that you're pulling things up, if you're making swirl marks in your clay, you're moving too quick, and that swirl mark is now a thin area that's corkscrewing up that pot. And so when you go to do another pull, every time you go over that little swirl mark, there's a little divot that your fingers go into. And all that makes it harder to control. So I'm going to collar this together right now because it's kind of starting to head out a little bit. And I always want it to be going in. So I'm going to do a decent amount of water on the outside of the pot and on my hands. And now I'm just going to kind of squeeze together and bring this from the bottom to the top. Now I'm going to compress the lip. I haven't talked about that yet, but you always want to compress the lip after every pull, after every movement. All right, so we'll do a third pull here. Go back all the way to the bottom, even though I have to flare it out to get my hand in there. All right, so here we go. Slow and steady. And right now my elbow needs to be up in the air, so I have to actually think about that. Keep my elbow still. And now I think I can stop the motion of the pull, put my elbow down, maybe do something else, and now I can get right back to where I was and just continue the motion of that pull all the way to the top. So when you're throwing cylinders, ideally you're getting most of your height in 3 pulls, but that's not very realistic for most people. 5, 6, 7, or 8 pulls is fine too. I'm going to straighten this up with the rib a little bit. It's actually kind of a nice vase shape, which is also, everything comes from a cylinder as far as vases, mugs, pitchers, things like that. So after you pull the cylinder, then you can go and do your shaping pulls if you'd like. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. Use the rib. So I'm holding onto the rib really tight with my hand and pressing in from the outside. And I also have my finger right on the inside of the pot so that I can offer some counter pressure against the rib. So the rib's staying where it is, my hand on the inside's moving. So the rib will help shape your pot. It'll also help strengthen your pot because it removes a lot of this really wet clay. And so it's a good idea to use the rib throughout the process. You can also use the rib to clean up the bottom of the cylinder. Now that I've dried it off, I'll do one more pull, and then we'll cut this in half and see what it looks like. And this isn't really compressing all the clay together, or not compressing all the way up. It's more like just evening it out. And to be honest, I'm probably to the point where I'm overworking it, which anybody that practices on the wheel knows that it's really easy to overwork your piece. So with wheel throwing, it's all about repetition to get muscle memory. So the best thing to do is, if you feel like you kind of reached the limit with this piece of clay, cut it off. And if you have the energy, put another piece of clay on. So when you sit down at the wheel, you want to have a few balls of clay ready to go in a bag so you don't have to get up and wedge and lose all that momentum. So to cut this in half, I'm just going to bring the wire straight underneath and then stop halfway and pull up. And then I can pull the cylinder back and we can kind of see what it looks like on the inside. And this is a really great thing to do. So cutting your piece in half to look at the cross section and see where your extra clay might be hiding. In a case like this, the walls are pretty good, but I would turn this over when it's leather hard and I'd be able to trim a foot into this and remove this clay. And I even left the base thick enough that I could cut a foot right into the bottom there. So that would be the finished look of the cylinder if I had kept it and trimmed the piece. What do you think?